Good afternoon and welcome to Do You See What I See? I'm Yolanda Nava. Today's guest is a man who made history as a conscientious objector, as a man of peace, and the coordinator for the National Chicano Moratorium, August 29th, 1970. It was a day that we are continuing to commemorate. It's been 55 years now. I was there that day. I got tear gassed. I was terrified. Many were. There were 5 people that were killed that day, and we'll talk more about that. But I want to bring on Rosalio Muñoz, who was the coordinator of August 29th, 1970, a peace activist and a conscientious objector who has created much good for humanity. Welcome, Rosalio.
Oh, glad to be here. Looking forward to telling the story and getting some good questions about the meaning and uh, trying to get deeper into it.
Well, it's something that needs to be, it's an event that needs to be understood in history. It has been partially told. Many people were there that day. There were 30,000 people who showed up in East Los Angeles for a march against the war. It was a peaceful demonstration, and 30,000 people from across the country showed up to demonstrate, protest the war peacefully. And they came from across the country, from cities and barrios across the United States to East Los Angeles, because at that time, while the Mexican Americans were only 4% of the US population, the war dead in Vietnam were 25% Chicano Mexican American. And when they came back from the war, they didn't get housing and civil rights, employment rights, etc. So the march was to be against war and to be for civil and human rights for the returning veterans, and also to celebrate a day of culture. It was really a lovely day at first, and then it all changed. You were involved in organizing that event, and it's a it's an interesting start for your major part of your life after being student body president at UCLA when
Mhm.
the population was only 4%. What skills did you learn running for president with such low population margin that you applied to creating that national moratorium?
Well, my parents were college graduates, and many of my father's family, almost all of them were teachers. My mother was a
Wow.
teacher. She went to Arizona, University of Arizona and Arizona State, and in the mid and later 30s began a real strong movement for more Mexican American teachers to begin teaching and to recruit others to fight for bilingual education, ethnic studies, not more knowledge about Mexico, and the join in the struggle for civil rights. And so, and we similar. My mother's family were pioneers in Tucson, Arizona, starting around 1800. So my mother was like fifth generation, and they were Americans of Mexican descent, and but very Mexican, let me tell you. But so that when I went to UCLA, I had uh, 10 cousins and my two older siblings, my older brother and sister, in college. Actually, my brother and sister were at UCLA when I was a freshman, and I roomed with my brother. So I had cousins at Arizona, Arizona State, Cal State LA. My cousin Felix was a student president at 65, spoke at a teach-in against the war. I had others in, his sisters were in Stanford. Our San Fernando cousins were in Berkeley. And so we were pretty spread out. It was an expectation for most of us that we were going to college, and our younger siblings, most of them also were. So with that there, it's not quite as surprising. But yes, when I got there on campus my freshman year, my older sister told me the same thing. People asked me if I were from India. It was a common question. They weren't used to seeing people from East LA, Mexicans, and except maybe busing the cafeteria or working in the gardens and the trees and cutting the all of that kind of work. So, but what I learned there, and getting the clues and hints of, who were maybe some of the best professors, what were the different kinds of social life, etc., what to expect from fraternities and sororities, and what from commuters and dormies and independents like we were. My brother and I living with friends from our high school in an apartment. So I had that advantage, and I learned about all of those different things. And I stayed away from the fraternities. This was 1964. So I thought I was made a lot of offers, but I think they would have preferred to have me than have an African American as their minority recruit, because that was the way attitudes were there at UCLA. And I wanted to be an intellectual. I wanted to know, get as much knowledge as possible. But very soon, the very departmentalized, more narrow attitudes of people in academia, or as one of my friends later on called cacademia, uh, that that really to understand the world, you needed a more uh, broad approach, not just historical, but political science, sociology, geography, all of those things. You needed a more systemic look at the phenomena of the world. And that's what I focused uh, after the first couple of years. Then I focused on that and started saying, how can we do that? And the student movement for student freedom, political, but also academic. And the academic side became that for me. And it's a long story, but I helped become the founder of what we called an experimental college, where students put their own classes together, or professors could do it, and others. And they weren't for credit, but they were for discussion. And but that was a criticism. After working on that, another thing arose, a professor evaluation book, where using the computer cards that we registered with, we also could mark on the thing you ran through the machine, uh, numerically saying 1 to 10 about qualities of their teaching, but also having what you would call uh, subjective comments of the students. And the ones that really cared to write something, uh, I got the tasks of reading those and then digesting them, or putting in what I felt, or we felt, was the most salient things they were saying. And that was a tremendous experience, and also some leverage over professors, because there were our
That's
opinion.
fascinating.
Yes. And so from there, it went on to demanding that students be on the board of regents, on the faculty senate, and that we have uh, uh, looking at systemic racism, or looking at the environment more systemically, et cetera. So there were advanced things, but we had also one topic, I guess, some graduate student, psychosexual paralysis and the contemporary syndrome. That was one. So there
Well,
was.
you were certainly you're certainly a change maker, and a way ahead of your time because of your generational background, which is rather interesting and very different from what so many of the students, were at that time. I was the first girl to go to college in my family, and my parents came across the border in 1921 or three, something like that. And so I'm first generation born in this country. You got through that. You had a wonderful mind and that family and background. What is it that triggered your desire to organize the Chicano Moratorium, and what strategies? Because it was a very strategically well done event. 30,000 people is no small task to pull together, a bunch of Mexicans to talk to each other at one time is quite a feat, and to have 30,000 was really miraculous. How did that happen?
Well, okay. With the civil rights movement, with the poverty program that arose, um, and there were more money for students that were qualified, let's say, and could make it in, and EOP, Economic Opportunities Program. Uh, and that's up the numbers, not all that significantly, but starting around 65 and 66, there were a few more and few more, and then it got to the critical mass where there are enough of us to form a group. And it was happening. There was SNCC of the African Americans that were
Yes.
in the foreground of the civil rights struggle, and getting arrested and getting killed and all of that. So that was in the air. You had the Cuban Revolution and all of things around that. There was a tremendous amount of growth from those periods, uh, a continued growth from the turn of the centuries that we went from maybe 17% of the population then in LA, and now we're like 51, 52, 53%. Tremendous growth of but that was starting to happen, and there were enough of us to get together, and many were from Mexico or got some of their education from Mexico, whose education was qualitatively better than what we had in East LA and
Oh,
other
yes.
barrio schools, so that some of the brighter ones were there. And so, in fact, it was for me, my Spanish wasn't that great at all. So I said, oh my God, I can't speak Spanish, because I'd go to meetings. And some of those guys, especially, really, you know, really could rap. But it was, I
Yeah.
said, how can I keep up with these guys? But anyway, so those were some of the things. And then we like to eat beans. When my mother went to Arizona in the beginning of the Depression, there were like four or five of them. And I told a Mecha convention one time, yeah, held there at University of Arizona, that when my mother was there, there were only four or five Chicanos, and they all ate lunch together every day. And the students said, how could they do that? You got to be studying so much. And I said, but they were all eating their tacos and frijoles, because the whites would laugh at them and make fun of them if they, if you were just alone, so you did it together. But anyway, that's what came from it. And there were some very, very bright people. You knew Juan Gomez Quinones. And so
Of
he was
course.
in UMass. And one of the things they did, we got to start getting into our history. So what was big at that time? Cesar Chavez and the farm workers and all of that. So Juan went around and asked different people to write up some of the strikes in the early 30s in Southern California, but in the Los Angeles County, Imperial Valley, and as to the San Joaquin Valley. So different people wrote different ones. I ended up with one about a lettuce strike in Calexico, just on the other side of Mexicali. There was much that I learned from there. First of all, the LA Times was the biggest agricultural landholder both in Imperial County and all along both sides of the border, and how
Really?
there
Oh,
was
the
even
Chandlers, yeah.
that there were one of the top uh, civil rights lawyers then for the ACLU went out to investigate after they bombed a meeting, the police, and they stopped this A.L. Wirren, Abraham Lincoln Wirren, uh, at the Salton Sea. And he said, they said there were reporters, a couple of guys. They said there were reporters for the LA Times, showed him ID, and he got out of his car. They beat him up and pantsed him and left him there. So what was then you found out later when you researched more why the LA Times was with the LAPD way out of the city of Los Angeles on this thing. And so to make it short, though, to look at where you found information about that was in the La Follette report that I think very few of us know, who was a progressive, I think, Wisconsin senator. And, they had the anti-American committees and all that. This was a counter and the anti-labor violence that was being done across in the Depression. And so it was all over in the South, in Appalachia, in the North, in the Midwest, and all of these places. But they had us right there in Calexico, you know, and all those areas. And then I said, wow, we're part of this fabulous labor movement in our country that was fighting for all these rights way back then. Later, it wasn't until later I found out my dad was hopping on freight trains to go into copper mines to recruit students because the principals and the police department, they didn't, and the companies didn't want somebody telling them, hey, you can get ahead in life if you go to college. But
Right.
anyway, um, so that was that, and that was, my actually after about 4.5 years, when I was learning that, and I had just got elected student president because I could, and then I told a friend that was had spent the previous summer heading up the Pittsburgh uh, boycott office for the farm workers, and he helped me get elected. I told him I think I could win because there were special circumstances, and he said, and I was just saying, just kind of offhand saying that I wasn't thinking about it, and he says, well, if you can do that, it would be great for the movement. And I thought about it, yeah. So we did it, and he went organized a good campaign. I had also a very good Jewish American guy who was also a tremendous organizer. And the campus. But one way to get the sorority vote is to get your leaflets out on the South Campus, and this where the sciences are, because that all the women would be going through there to get to their sororities. And actually,
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
after
On
all
Hillgard
this, yeah,
Avenue, yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Because they wanted to marry doctors, lawyers, scientists, and so they're hanging out where all those departments were. But it's
yeah,
so you
but
got your
anyway,
lessons in organizing very, very early on from your family and through your interest in reaching out and running for office and your connection with the labor movements throughout the United States. So that became the network then for the Chicano movement. I mean,
yeah,
for the
well, that
moratorium.
helped. That gave me an understanding and all of that, and people like Juan and others. That was the orientation. That was, well, the leader at MAPA during that period, especially I think was the vice chair and then the chair was Bert Corona, who was
Yes.
a community labor political organizer par excellence. That is one of the main reasons California is a blue state today and doing well economically, and we have a lot more representation now. So those are some of the the roots and getting to know people like him and others. The first thing that I was asked to do, I was on the student council before I was president, and so the movement had started. And the top people of the Chicano movement started, they decided they had to break away from just getting patronage from Johnson because he was upping the war, upping the number of minorities going to the front lines, cutting back on the poverty program. Martin Luther King had the same approach, and many of the progressive African Americans and our most progressive leaders also decided, especially after they decided to change the recruiting from what they did after World War II to a more elite kind of military. But they took it back and to the standards that they used for World War II, when they needed all kinds of of carne de cañón or uh,
Yeah, soldiers. You needed on the ground soldiers, right?
yeah. So that was done in 65 and 66. So by 67, the big African American, that's where King gave his big speech at Riverside Drive, and all these, and we had others speaking out, but we were much smaller and much lesser representation.
Messages. Two
We
unread
didn't
messages.
until
Double tap to
60,
open.
yeah, we didn't have the more progressive Chicano representatives until 62. Now, those that were elected were good on many issues from Texas and New Mexico, but none that were against the war at the very beginning. But two were elected, and George Brown and Ed Roybal, and they were two of the more progressive people and peace-minded. Brown was a Quaker
Yes.
from Whittier, which was more peaceful minded than Nixon was. So, but anyway, some of the most progressive and anti-war guys in Congress, and they represented the heart of East Los Angeles. So we had that kind of representation there. And the fact that we were able to have more students on the campus, you could see. Now, me, I wasn't this. I was in a middle class family, and we lived on a hill in Highland Park. But uh, when the students from East LA or from the main barrios in the harbor area or in near Santa Monica and Venice, and where in the San Fernando Valley, Pacoima and San Fernando. They got to look at all these white guys running around. In the neighborhood, there weren't many brown guys running around, or they were a whole lot less. Your brother, your neighbor, your cousin was in the army or working in the fields, maybe in prison or uh, in some kind of a penal community for young people. So that it was very obvious that once you could, add that up, the awareness of the unfairness, and there was money. There was money for more statistics because of our political development. We were getting more people, and our biggest concentrations were in Texas and California, and that was also true for with African Americans. And so those were the two biggest borders, well, states that were close. And the difference, it was the minority turnout and both African American. And so that's one of the reasons why in the mid 60s there was a poverty program, an end to the Bracero program, the beginnings of bilingual education, which of course raised more expectations. And so that's what we carried with us into the communities And the walkouts were one of the first results of there were tremendous struggles. My parents were doing it in Arizona, others all over the country, fighting to get better education. That was our number one thing. And a
Yes.
lot of that talent were those that were fighting with the Board of Education to get things done. And the program they designed to get passed, try to get things done in the Board of Education, became the demands of the walkouts in 1968. So that was leadership from that had been prepared by the previous generations, like my parents and my aunts and uncles. But so uh, that was there. It happened in 68 and 69. And I have uh, one of the anti-war demonstrations right after 9/11, we started mobilizing for peace. And Rudy Acuña, one of our greatest historians, wrote about the start of Chicano studies at the Northridge campuses, at state university campuses. They were colleges then. But he said that starting in September of 1969, it coincided the starting of the program with yours truly, Rosalio Muñoz, refusing induction that presented a face to relate ourselves to the struggle in Vietnam and those issues arising. And that
Well, it
was
was
the
very
whole.
significant. It was very significant that you were a conscientious objector and you were a peace advocate. How did that play into your energy and your drive to initiate this, anti-war moratorium?
Well, I describe myself identity as a Chicano Christian communist who's who's indigenous to this planet, and that's my experience and my
Okay,
upbringing.
okay.
And well, some of it was we didn't like what happened to the Indians growing up, and then my dad, when I was 16, I had a sabbatical leave. He worked with the school district in social work. And we traveled all over Mexico. He went to every state in Mexico and reported on how all of the public schools in the different states were organized, uh, with the hopes that the board would start adjusting, because actually more and more Mexican youth were part of the families coming over tremendously. And how much attention they paid, I'm going to be looking into that. I've been working on some memoirs. But anyway, so I got to know that culture a lot more. My Spanish improved, and I could see that even though there were differences and different culture, different instruments, different kinds of tunes with different indigenous roots, basically from the same types of instruments in the 17th century of Europe. The ones that we got were very similar to what the bluegrass music was in the hills of the South.
Yes.
And so a lot of the music is similar sometimes. But anyway, that's an observation. But anyway, so that was another thing. In many ways, all of the different states, areas of the Southwest matured or began their struggles, got more serious, and the racism grew and became more institutionalized at different times. So in New Mexico, they identified themselves as Spanish.
Yes.
Texas, they used the
Or
term,
Hispanos, yeah.
yeah, and then on in Texas it was Latinos. Uh, in Arizona, at least people, my mother's having generations, were Americans of Mexican descent.
Hmm.
And in California, what was beginning to grow was Mexican American,
Yes.
and that later became Chicano. But so there were these differences that made it very hard to put together a national or Southwest-wide kinds of things. The different organizations had different ways. But I had could see that in
Calendar,
Mexico.
Friday, August 5th, activate, default.
Ignore that.
Okay. Anyway, so that's
Power
some of
off,
the
button,
background
power on.
that I had. And then I was in Mexico that the fall and from the fall of 1962, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I had friends that I played basketball with, I had friends that I got a letter from one of them saying all my basketball buddies were thinking about volunteering to go to Cuba. And I'm there in Mexico and in Excelsior, Novedades, and all over the place, there was sympathy with Cuba.
Yes.
And I said, hey, the whole world doesn't have the worldview of John Wayne. And well,
But
and
these are very important trends and shifts. So your consciousness was embedded in the Christ-like care and love and take care of your neighbor philosophy of many of the Jesuits in Latin America that were helping lead the social democratic movements there.
yeah. So, now in a way I like to amend the Beatitudes and add at the end from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. But that's part of my
But
values.
I think your vision, I think, because, in our conversations that we've had more recently, the sense I get is your activism, your strategic thinking was highly driven by your value system, your virtues, this idea of nonviolence, of peace, of conscientious objection to a war that was never going to be won, and it was a debacle that actually took Johnson down. And so, how did you begin? And I think we're going to do two parts of this conversation. But how did you begin to build those networks around the country to bring those 30,000 people to East LA for the moratorium?
Well, I graduated in 69. I got a job with Ron Lopez, whom you know. He got the job to start the Chicano programs, Mexican American, at the Claremont colleges. So we had worked together on getting some of the things at UCLA that the previous year in 68, 69. And but I was getting a good paycheck and all of that kind of stuff. But I then thought in going out on dates to see Easy Rider or Hair or Alice's Restaurant that summer. And I'm saying, hey, I had made a decision. If I get drafted, I have to refuse. We had a close friend, Joe Majlish, who was a history major, who was a resistor, and that meant they made examples of themselves not going to the draft. So they mostly went to jail, mostly defended themselves. And then I could see that this guy that was always with a smile, always positive, I saw him one dusk as he was going to be having to go to prison. And the history department had voted, well, it was a close vote, but denied him being able to take away the years he was in prison from the requirements of his PhD schedule. So he was, they didn't recognize that. But I could see him very sad as in the dusks. And I was going to go up and talk to him. I said, well, no, I'll leave him to himself right here. But I left seeing, the pains that what he was going to have to go through to me. That's real courage. And
Yes.
I'm going to have to show real courage if I get drafted. But I said, it's going to have to be in ways that reduce the war. What if they gave a war and nobody came?
Nobody came.
My favorite slogans. Um, and but it was going to have to also lower the death rates of all, but address the problems that people of color and we as us Mexicanos also faced in the barrios. And it says it can't be come across like passive resistance. It's got to be assertive, a more positive people's macho, and uh, to reach the youth. And so when I got a draft notice for September 16th, 1969, happened to be picking up my mom and with my older brother, and she had asked us to accompany us to the death of a nephew, third, well, a couple of families removed in Long Beach. So I'm thinking about, I didn't tell neither I went in the house where we put the mail. I saw one and it was the first one and looked, and it was greetings from the president to report on Mexican Independence Day. So I had all this mass to think through it. And when I did, I went to the guy that helped me get elected, and Ramses, and I said, I'd like you, I think this could be the springboard for upping, by mobilizing more participation of our people against the war and for social justice, both together.
Well, that
And
sounds like a good place for us to take a break. And we're going to do a part 2 on this next month. But you're giving us some really excellent background to what happened to leading up to the moratorium. And of course, we're going to celebrate this the end of this month, August 29th, 1970. And I will just wind this part up by saying that there were 5 people that were killed at that Chicano Moratorium. One of them was Ruben Salazar, who was a journalist for the LA Times and also with the Spanish language television station KMEX television. And that's a whole chapter unto itself that many in the community felt that that was a hit. It was a deliberate death, although it wasn't considered that by the inquest. But I'm going to stop here, Rosalío, because our time is running out for today. But I want to thank you so much for sharing this history that is little known and very important to understanding what's going on today. And we'll deal with that too in the future. And thank you so much. God bless you. And may you stay well and healthy. And to the audience, I want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Do You See What I See? We'll be back next month, mid-month. I'm Yolanda Nava. Have a great month and have a commemoration day to recall that day, August 29th, 1970. Learn more about it, read about it, and tune in again next month. Thank you for joining me. I'm Yolanda Nava.